Welcome to our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We hope that you are joining us once again. If you're joining us for the first time, I'd encourage you to go back and start all the way back to the beginning of these studies. We're nearing the end of our study of this Gospel. We're coming into the 26th chapter today and nearing the climax. As we go through the Gospel of Matthew, it is not telling just historical events that none of them take any precedence over another, but it is telling the story of starting at the entry of Jesus into this life, but then culminating and climaxing at the moment of his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And so we're getting really to the most important part of the gospel. We are going to be going through these questions today with Luke, who's with us from Mississippi, and then Leonard Westbrook, one of our elders, and Chris Duke, one of our deacons here at Pepper Road. And so thankful for them all joining us today. We looked at chapter 25 in our last class this past Wednesday, and we went through most of the chapter. And I just want to make kind of some concluding remarks that draw that together and really draw it together inclusive of chapter 24. At the end of chapter 24, we were talking about a transition from the destruction of Jerusalem over into final judgment. And I think that notion is really pressed home here in chapter 25 as we look at these three stories. We looked at the parable of the virgins, we looked at the parable of the talents, and then this representation of Jesus's return when he separates the sheep and the goats on the right hand and on the left. And in each case, he talks about those who are condemned. And so as we look at those condemnations and then drawing in that condemnation there at the end of chapter 24, what similarities do you see there, Luke, about all those judgments being called there on those who are condemned in those three parables?
Well, at the end of chapter 24 in verse 51, he says that after talking about being ready and being prepared, it says it will cut them in pieces and assign them a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then you go over to chapter 25 and verse 30, and this is at the end of the parable of the talents. And in verse 29 he says, "For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have it in abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And then you go later towards the end of chapter 25, in verse 45, he says, "Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. These will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." So there's a separation, and seems to be pointing to this final separation, and that's kind of goes along with the messaging of being prepared and being on alert and being ready for the coming of the Lord throughout towards the end of chapter 24, and then throughout all of 25 he's talking about being prepared for that day, because there will be that final separation, and so you need to be prepared for the coming of the Lord. And then in each of these separations, especially towards the end of 25 in verse 46, he uses frequent language of there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And what we understand this is talking about is hell, ultimately, of that ultimate separation. But then you also have at verse 46, the other side of that, the righteous will go to eternal life. And we know that that's pointing to heaven.
Yeah, absolutely. The couple of things there, that contrast between the destruction of Jerusalem versus this final judgment, but also the very strong language. People want to soften the blow of hell, soften the blow of the condemnation that Jesus makes. It is hard, particularly in these passages, so hard to get around for people to figure out how to explain away hell when Jesus speaks about it in such stark terminology. And so we want to be careful that we don't, in our desire to sort of maybe make God more merciful, try to be more merciful than God, that we fail to recognize the justice of his judgment and the intensity of that judgment as it's described here. Well, chapter 24 really, I think, culminates a progress of thought that's been going on for a few chapters now. And that culmination is in the destruction of Jerusalem, followed then by the more sweeping judgment that will happen when Christ returns. And so the Pharisees certainly do not like, I mean, you think about chapter 23, that they would be quite upset by all of this language that Jesus has been using. And as we come into chapter 26, we see that it says, it came to pass when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. And then we see that the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas. And they plotted to take Jesus, it says in the New King James, it says by trickery, to kill him. In the New American Standard, it says that they did so by stealth. And so what is the reason for their stealth? And Chris, did I assign you that question or Leonard? Leonard, is that yours? Okay.
I think that's fine.
Yeah, so you go ahead with that one.
Well, as you pointed out, the translations of the New King James is that they plotted by trickery. The New American Standard and some other versions use stealth, and the Old King James uses the word subtlety. You kind of get an idea of their character already from chapters 23 in particular, of these leaders of the Jews. And I noticed even down in the end of chapter 26, in the trial, verse 59, I think, now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death. So we have a pretty good idea here what their character was from what we've already seen. If we go back to chapter 23, early in that chapter, in verses 3 through 7, we get an idea, a reminder, I guess, now of their character. But verse 5, after telling us that they tell us what to do, but they don't do it themselves. Verse 5, he says, but all their works they do to be seen by men. Verse 6, they love the best places of the best places at feast, the best seats in the synagogues. They love to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. So as we look at their character and we look at what they're plotting here on this, they, in the next few verses, we see that they did not, in verse 5 here, they didn't want it to be done during the feast. They didn't want to cause an uproar with the people. They just wanted to convince the people how evil Jesus was. They had false witnesses lined up. Finally, they had false witnesses lined up. That was not an easy task to find someone that would testify against Jesus. So they, again, are evil men trying to do the devil's work, and certainly were successful in convincing enough people to get him crucified eventually.
Yeah. So as we, look at that notion that they're worried about what the people think, and as you suggest, that's part of their character. I mean, it's who they are. But it's political in nature. They're having to maneuver, and I just think from the standpoint of, that how condemning that is, that when you go about things in a political mindset, in a crafty mindset, by trickery, and they're trying to, there's no honesty. That this should reveal to ourselves. This is not an honest approach. This people in politics, people do this all the time. They say, we just want the truth. And then they expose, that's not what they want. They just want to expose their enemies. That's what they want to do. It's not about the truth. And so certainly that is the case with these Pharisees and scribes, Sadducees, that they just want to take him out. The other thing that's interesting, we've already noted this from the triumphal entry, is that still, even at this hour, we're well into the week, and even at this moment, they are scared of the people's reaction. And so they have to craft this in such a way, but they are crafty. I was talking to somebody not too long ago, a few days ago, about our current media, and he was just talking about how that, you know, the media and the information has never been so deceptive and never had such control over people and so forth. And I said, well, you know, in Jesus's day, they were able to take a whole city from praising him and bowing down and shouting Hosanna before him to shouting crucify by the end of the week. That's pretty effective, you know, misinformation campaign that they have going there. And so I just want to remember all along the way, what a great shift these Pharisees and Sadducees are able to make with these people. They're able to take the mob from polar opposite positions and get them to be on board with the crucifixion of Jesus. Well, as we look then past that just sort of brief reminder that Jesus is being persecuted, he's being hounded by these, we then turn our attention to sort of just pressing on with Jesus's plans. And it's interesting to me that that's sort of the case. Like, here's what's happening in the background. Here's Jesus, not unaware of that, but he's pressing forward, of course, with his week and all the things that he intends to say and do during this week. So the thing that he's doing next is that he comes to the house in Bethany of Simon the leper. We don't know much about Simon the leper, just that that he's hosting this feast on this last week. We do see over in John's gospel that some of the attendees are Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha. And so we combine that to get a little bit of information. This is different, incidentally, from Simon the Pharisee and the woman, the adulterous woman who comes and washes Jesus's feet on that occasion. So we don't want to mix those two up. I think sometimes commentaries do that. But at any rate, it doesn't tell us that it's Mary. It just, in this case, it just tells us a woman. A woman comes and she breaks this alabaster flask and she begins to anoint Jesus with this oil. Now, what is the complaint with regards to that anointing of Jesus there, Chris?
Well, it tells us the disciples were very, in some of the versions, indignant, very upset that she would do this because they considered it waste. They considered it excessive. It goes on to point out that this was very costly oil. If we take the other versions into account, Mark's and John's, potentially worth 300 denarii. If it was spikenard, from what we find out, it was a very expensive oil used in very special occasions. And so they, for whatever reason at this point, after what they've seen and what they've declared about Jesus, it's interesting that they would be very critical of what she's done here, and in fact criticize her sharply for this. From John's version, if this is the same incident, it also mentions that Judas was really upset about it and criticized her, not so much because of waste that could help the poor, but for the fact that he was a thief. If this is the same occasion here, so it's interesting that they're very critical of this, and they make the point that it should be there to help the poor. But Jesus then is going to kind of redirect them and point out something about the situation, the fact that they'll have the poor with them for the rest of their time. He will not be here for very much longer. So again, pointing them to what's happening and that he is on the march toward the cross, and trying to refocus their thoughts, I believe, here is what's trying to happen. But nonetheless, the disciples act very harshly against this woman, and it's kind of unusual to see this happen at this point after the teaching that Jesus has done to them, and the fact the things we see that he has in fact done for them and will do for them here very shortly.
Yeah, when you think about the way that, think about these apostles who have been with Jesus for the last couple of years, their whole thought process has shifted, or at least it's supposed to have shifted. And Jesus, I mean, you can imagine outside of Judas, whose testimony, whose mindset we do get from the Gospel of John, outside of Judas, you can imagine that they think that they're saying the correct thing here. Like, hey, this is wasteful. These are the same apostles that Jesus has said, leave everything and come after me. And they're looking at this extravagance and thinking, this is so inappropriate. And I think that there's a real opportunity for balance here in our mindsets, that we are to be, compassionate and thoughtful, and be careful about extravagances. And yet Jesus lets them know that you can go even too far in that direction. That there's a mindset that forgets that these things that God gives us have multiple uses. So yes, giving to the poor is a virtuous thing, and yet so is this. This is also an appropriate thing. And I think most people, they head off in the extremes, and they think this is always the thing that ought to be done, or this is always the thing that ought to be done. And so I think here's Jesus rebuking some of the very instruction that he's given himself, or at least taking to an extreme some of the instruction he's given himself. I just add to that the idea of the extent of the extravagance. She breaks the bottle. Like, that's not, I'm going to use some of this. That is, I'm breaking this. I'm using all of it. There's no intent to hold any of it back, but to give all of that to Jesus. That this is real honor that Mary is showing in this case. And I do believe that it is the same occasion there in John chapter 12. I think it's hard to separate those two occasions. That's in Bethany. All of the other elements, the only difference is that John tells us she anointed his feet. We just combine those and see that certainly it could have included both the head and the feet. But it's an honor. The other thing that I would note is that Jesus accepts the honor. We want to note all the occasions where Jesus accepts worship. He does not say, like Peter would say, I'm just a man, don't worship me. Jesus accepts the worship and then says it's appropriate. And so there's nothing untoward in this extravagance, because she is doing this for God in the flesh. Well, as you mentioned, John does give us that motivation of Judas. Matthew does not. However, Matthew then does turn the attention to Judas. And I wonder if, even though he doesn't give us the motivation, there is some indication, that Matthew says essentially all the apostles, all the disciples are sort of asking this question, but then the focus comes to Judas in a way that maybe sort of reminds us that John says, yes, but Judas particularly had a problem with this. And so as that focus comes to Judas, Luke, what does Judas do next after this episode?
So in verse 14, it says that one of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" And they weighed out 30 pieces of silver to him. And from then on, he began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. I would agree with Chris and Stephen, as they said, that I think that this is most likely what John is talking about in chapter 12. It seems hard to separate them. And I do, and I would agree also that I think that maybe there's some connection between the previous verses that we read in Matthew and then down to verse 14 through 16, because in Matthew and Mark, this conversation occurs, and then right after it talks about Judas's bargain, and it coincidentally or incidentally, I I think that those would be connected. And that they were talking about the money, and why would this woman not use it for money? And so I think there might be maybe something to say there about Judas's attitude, and what his desires drove him to do. But also in verse 16, I also think there's something to be said there about the desire, because it says that he began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. I mean, just from this moment, and even after this, you're going to see him eating with Jesus, and then finally he takes that opportunity to leave and go get the people to arrest Jesus. And so, the desire started all the way back when, and it's as long as the desire stayed, the motive and the action followed. And so, I think there's a lesson to be learned there about how we need to be careful of what we're desiring, and maybe we need to try and figure out a way to change that desire.
Yeah, and as I said, as we combine this with John's gospel, here Matthew is pointing out the greed of Judas right after this episode of this questioning of the expense that is laid on Jesus. And so, how far does that greed go? Well, as you just described, it goes so far that he's willing to betray Jesus. And just the very question, what will you give me? That we can talk more. There's a sense of, what did Judas think was going to happen? How did he think that this was going to play out? But the bottom line is, what he wants is to gain. And there is, just at the very bottom of this, is a greed. And John makes that more explicit, but Matthew also here pointing out the greed of Judas. Well, it says, from that time he sought that opportunity to betray him. As we think about that opportunity to betray him, remember that the problem is not in front of the people, not in front of the crowds. And so the opportunity, it's not like to betray him from the standpoint of telling them who he is. They know who he is. And we'll get to that later on. It's the idea of finding an opportunity where they can come and grab him where nobody's around. Where's the chance to come and do this in a way that they will not raise the anger, or they won't cause a riot. And so I think that's the idea here, just to add that to that conversation there, that looking for the opportunity is looking for the secret moment. Well, you see, we're going back and forth here. Here's the plotting. Here's Jesus. Here's more plotting. And then now we're back to, what does Jesus do next? And so we come to this feast that they eat together. And so what meal do they eat together? And I just might add to that, Leonard, what does Jesus use that meal to teach about?
Well, the meal, obviously, as he reads verse 17, now on the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he says in verse 18 that he'll keep the Passover with them. So the meal, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Passover, there's probably multiple reasons why it was important. But here's Jesus, who's wanting to eat this meal with his disciples prior to his crucifixion. And here's the one that in the beginning was the crafter of this plan of the feast, of all the history that goes behind that with the Jews. And yet also it points forward then to the meal that he's going to eat with them, and the establishment of what we will partake of on the Lord's Day every week, to remember his life, his burial, his resurrection, his death, his burial, his resurrection. And we know, because of this feast, some of the elements that we are to partake of. The unleavened bread, we know that is what Jesus instituted That's what he has for us to do as we remember his sacrifice for us. And so it is an important moment at that time, and certainly an important moment for us throughout our lives and through all time since then and into the future until he comes again.
Yeah, and I think as we recognize this, that's the setting of the teaching of the Lord's Supper. Sometimes people will say that, you know, the Lord's Supper is the Christian Passover, that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. They'll use the language of tithing to describe the giving of our means and so forth. And we push back against that. And we say it's not just that here's the Passover and then the Lord's Supper replaces that, and here's the Sabbath and then the first day of the week replaces that, and then here's tithing and then here's our tithing. And I agree with that what we're doing is not that. And yet I also think that we need to recognize the connection between those things. That what we're doing now is not disconnected. It is not the Passover that we do on the first day of the week, but it is not disconnected from the Passover. And as Jesus comes in, I think that really what we see is he is the Passover lamb. You know, if you go back and you just read through Exodus chapter 12 and you just see the description of the Passover, it's hard, after you've read the New Testament, it's hard not to see Jesus in the description of the Passover. And so he becomes the Passover lamb. And in the same way that he represents the meal that they ate in the Passover, well, certainly he represents the meal that we eat in the Lord's Supper. And so I think there's just a real bridge of a connection there. It's not just that, well, here's an opportunity and we happen to be together, let me go ahead and teach about this. It's more of, no, there's some real significance there in the bridge between the Passover and what we do today. And so it's more than happenstance, to be sure. I would just add to that, it's more than happenstance that he is sacrificed. The Passover lamb is sacrificed during Passover. And you know, we'll think about that more as we get to that point of the crucifixion. Well, as he's going through this meal of the Passover, and really before he gets to the moment of teaching about the Lord's Supper, making that transition there, he indicates his betrayer here. And so how does he do that, Chris?
As we see here in Matthew's version, they're eating this meal, and it's interesting. This is a very intimate moment, really, with the 12 there. And it says, "Surely I say to you, one of you will betray me." And it says that, of course, all of them were exceedingly sorrowful, and basically each of them were saying to him, "Lord, is it I?" And he gave a very direct answer. He said, "He who dipped his hand with me in the dish will betray me." We have this recorded in all the Gospels, a little different variation. Mark's one who eats with me, one who's at the table with me in Luke. And so it's interesting. This is pointed out that this is how this will happen. In John, Jesus says in John 13:18, and it's kind of interesting. It's just after he washes the disciples' feet and talks to them about service and makes some points there. But he also talks about that in verse 11 says, "You are not all clean," because he knew who would betray him. And so in verse 18 he says, "I do not speak concerning all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled, he who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me." And that quotation is coming from Psalm 41:9. And so he directly points that out. And at the end here of the passage, the narrative here about this incident, Judas at the end basically says, "Rabbi, is it I?" And Jesus just says, "You have said." Kind of a chilling moment if you think about it at that point. And it is right before, as we've talked about, the institution of the Lord's Supper here. and the whole fact about what y'all have already mentioned about the Passover and Jesus being the Lamb. And in the midst of this, we have the one who would be the betrayer mentioned.
Yeah. When Judas, well, first of all, it's worth, I mean, just to add or emphasize there that all of them ask the question, is it me? But it's interesting to note that they all say, is it I, Lord? Then Judas comes and says, is it I, Rabbi? And so I really think he, in some ways, he shows his guilt in that he lowers the level of reverence. It's not that rabbi is not a title of honor, but it's a title of honor below. And I think that, from the standpoint of the way that people look at Jesus, you can look at Jesus as a good teacher, and that is a betrayal. That is not what he is. He is Lord. And if you don't recognize him as Lord, anything below that is a level that is really scorn in the end. And it's not that Judas didn't have any regard or honor for Jesus. It's just that it was not as high as it should be. And that left the door open for Judas to think that it was okay, to justify in his mind what he was doing here. I would just mention that some of the translations, New American Standard, for instance, will say, it's not me. You're not talking about me, are you? And so it's sort of with that negative, which makes it harder to understand when Jesus says, you have said it. I think it is a better translation to say, Rabbi, is it I? That affirmative. Are you talking about me? Jesus, you said it. And as you say, that chilling moment, I would add another thing to that the notion of dipping together. Hospitality doesn't carry the weight today that it has in cultures throughout the ages. But throughout the ages, hospitality has carried with it a definition of protection, that if we eat together, we have fellowship. If we eat together, that I'm claiming I would protect you, especially if it's my house that is giving the hospitality, you're under my protection. And so for Jesus to say that the one who will betray me is the one that I am dipping with, in other words, I'm eating with, I'm in that intimate fellowship with, that's the person who's going to betray me. I can just imagine people reading this with the mindset of all of that weight of hospitality. And that's sort of like a breathtaking sort of a thing to say. And so people reading the Gospel of Matthew and coming to the point and saying the betrayer is the one who dips his hand. Oh, are you dipped your hand into the oil with him and then you walked away to betray him? And so it would be a shocking way to sort of describe that betrayal. I would add to that as well that there is something to Jesus sharing this meal in John chapter 13, stooping down to wash their feet, and Judas is there the whole time. That Jesus is all the way up to the moment that Judas walks away, showing him kindness and love and returning good for evil. He knows that this is the man who's going to betray him with a kiss. And yet he continues to treat his enemy in just the way that he instructs us to treat our enemies. And doesn't treat him unkindly in any way. And even I would think with all these warnings is still trying to call Judas back away from this path of destruction. It has been noted from time to time that without the betrayer, then Jesus doesn't go to the cross. I don't buy that at all. I think that the Jews don't need Judas. The plotters don't need his participation. And yet his participation will be part of the story. It was predicted to be part of the story. But that doesn't get Judas off the hook. Judas is going to be guilty of making his decisions along this path. Well, we come down then to the institution of the Lord's Supper. During this meal, Jesus takes that that unleavened bread. He takes that cup of the fruit of the vine. He divides it there with his disciples. He blesses it and bids them eat. He speaks of the bread representing his body. And then he uses a phrase to represent the cup. And so what is that phrase, Luke? And where do we see that in the Old Testament?
So in verse 28, he says, well, at the end of verse 27, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Now, if you go all the way back to Exodus chapter 24, in verse 8, in Exodus chapter 24, this is the moment where all of Israel, the nation of Israel, come before God to affirm this covenant between the two. And so in verse 8, after they have prepared the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, they get down to verse 8, and Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. And so you know, kind of what we were just talking about a moment ago, that we look at what Jesus says here in Matthew chapter 26, talking about the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And again, this is language from the Old Testament. This is language from the Old Law. And when we come to the New Testament and read this, and even today, as we partake of the Lord's Supper every Lord's Day, we can't help but think back to this. In a sense, it's not disconnected from the Old Testament. It's not disconnected from that old law, because really what you learn is that the Old Covenant was pointing to Jesus, and it was pointing to really this in verse 28 of Matthew chapter 26. And Stephen, I'm sure you have much more to say about this in that aspect, but just that it's not disconnected from the Old Testament, because it's really pointing towards Jesus being the fulfillment. And that's when you come to the new covenant, really, now we remember this blood of the covenant.
Yeah, I do love that connection. And it's one of my favorite connections to think about. We see it again in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul highlights that phrasing, this blood of the covenant phrasing. And I think one of the things that is helpful is for us to go back and to consider that context, to go look at Exodus chapter 24 and read through that, and particularly to see what the people are saying in the context of the blood of the covenant. What they are saying is, we will do everything God has told us to do. We will listen to all of his commands. We will follow him in every way. They are entering, it's not just a one-sided covenant. No covenant is, but it is an agreement. God is supplying the blood, and he is ratifying the covenant, but these people are agreeing to something. And so I think it is helpful for us each week as we partake of the Lord's Supper that we think of that blood of the covenant, and that we think of the commitment, that our side of the commitment, just as the people were making that commitment back in Exodus chapter 24. And so it is beautiful to think of the foreshadowing, to think about all of that preparation that God went into, pointing forward all throughout the Old Testament. But it's not just the beauty that is worthy of contemplation, but rather the depth of what these people are saying, and the depth of what we're agreeing to, really, each and every week. We're ratifying and reminding ourselves, here's what we've agreed to. Here's what we've entered into. And so just like going back and reading about the Passover lamb helps us to think about, what Jesus is doing there in his sacrifice. Going back to Exodus 24 helps us think about our part of that commitment. So yes, I appreciate you bringing that connection together there. Well, Jesus, as we look there back at Matthew 26, we see that they first of all, they sing a hymn, and we can look to the Psalms and see some of the hymns that they likely sang there. And we do that too, incidentally. We sing a hymn to go along with the partaking of the Lord's Supper. But he tells them that something's going to happen. After they sing the hymn, they go out to the Mount of Olives, and he tells them what's going to happen when he goes to his crucifixion. And so, what does he describe there for them, Leonard? You're muted there.
I said this is a very sad time. Of those that he takes out with him, and as he addresses them and says that what's coming is going to be a trial for them, and that they're going to be made to stumble that very night because of his betrayal, his upcoming trial, and then crucifixion, and they're going to be scattered. And he quotes from Zechariah that chapter 13 and verse 7 that we recently studied in men's class, and tells them again that they are going to that the Satan is going to try them, and they're going to fail from that standpoint. And of course, without stepping on your next question, then Peter in particular responds back on that. And so it is a sad time, I know, for the Lord. And as we read these passages and we put ourselves in their places and ask ourselves, what would we have done? And are we ready to stand to the temptations that we'll have facing us today when we need to confess Christ, not deny him?
Yeah. Can you just imagine really all of the disciples? We're going to see how Peter speaks out, but can you imagine all of the disciples hearing this as we look at John's gospel, and he refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loves, the intensity of the relationship, and Jesus at this sad moment saying, you're all going to scatter. It's not hopeful. And you would be looking for some hopeful news. And this is not that. They're going to go through despair before they return to hope. But as Leonard alluded to, Peter is not having that. And Chris, what is his response to this notion that he would be a part of this falling away?
He is adamant that this will never happen. It states here in Matthew's version, even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. And so then Jesus follows that up and gives Peter a little bit more information. I'm sure information that Peter does not like to hear. The fact that he will betray him, and that he gives him a sign with the rooster crowing that you'll deny me 3 times. And so Peter reaffirms and reinforces what he's already said. He says, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. We're in Luke's version. It said he was willing to go both to prison and to death. That I'll do anything. I am not going to do this. I don't care what the rest of them do. I will not do this. And then it mentions here in Matthew's version that hearing this, the rest of the disciples kind of bolster their courage, and they proclaim the same thing, basically, that they all say that. And it's again astounding for them, I'm sure, to hear this after all that's just happened with the washing of their feet, the Passover feast, the institution of the supper here. And so all of them, I think, would have taken this and kind of been taken aback, but especially Peter. And of course, Peter would be the one, as we've seen, that would speak out and affirm this will not happen. It will never happen. That this will take place, Lord.
Yeah, and that makes it all the more sad when we actually do go through that. And just think, I mean, it's almost like Peter asks for this worst condemnation by speaking out. So, well, not me, and the sad part is it's almost like he said, maybe these jokers, I won't do that. And Jesus, no, you're going to be among the worst. And so the very one who thinks he is going to be stronger than the rest will prove to have maybe the most prominent fall among all the apostles. And yet he will be among the most prominent in returning, and be among the most prominent as they take up that mantle. And he is the taking the lead somewhat in preaching the gospel after Jesus is resurrected. Well, We will continue looking at this in our next class this Wednesday night. We'll get into the latter portion here of chapter 26, looking at the betrayal of Jesus and then the trial that follows. And so we encourage you to join us this Wednesday night. Again, we're continuing to live stream our classes on Wednesday at 7 p.m. And so you can join in then and follow along with us. We pray that these studies are helpful to you. Appreciate everybody who joins in and watches, as well as those who comment. We're grateful for your feedback. Appreciate these guys for joining in today, and we'll look forward to our next study and pray that God's blessings will be upon you until then.